So we did talk about Versailles last time, right?
Yeah. Queens.
We did talk about this, so we went through, okay, so we started French, but we hadn't really talked about anything. So we're talking about French Baroque. And Versailles, of course, is such an important place because it signifies the growing power of the French kings. The fact that by the 17th century, all attention is now, or by the end of the 17th century, all attention is on France. They now dominate in the Western world because of the power of the French kings, and they will continue to dominate and be the center of the art world. Whichever location is the sort of political center becomes the artistic center as well, because that's where the power is, that's where the money is, so that's where the artists are, and they're commissioning a lot of art.
Okay.
Yep.
Something that I had heard about the last time I toured Versailles was the Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah.
And at that time, a mirror was something that I mean, if you had a mirror, it was like this. It was imported from Italy. Mirrors just weren't a common kind of thing. And then to have a room where you could see your whole self. It was like the first movies that were ever.
Yeah, it was also came from theater design. There were theater stage sets that used mirrors and gold, and so they were borrowing a lot of Baroque design comes from theater, because that's what it was about. It was sort of theater presentation. So yeah, that's Versailles.
When we went through, it was pointed out there were no public restrooms. So where were people going?
I know they never talk about those things. All the things you study, they never talk about little things like that. But Versailles,
when you showed that plan,
right?
The place a couple classes ago, there's like one little tiny building has like baths or restrooms.
Oh yeah, the latrine. Yeah, it's sort of a group activity in monasteries. Absolutely was. But Versailles was very much open to the public. This was where the king and a lot of the aristocrats, and actually a couple thousand people lived actually at Versailles itself. But the grounds were open to the public most of the time. Even the building, people could come through several nights a week. I mean, the whole point is it's big and it's lavish to impress people. So you need people to come in and see it. It was open, and commoners would come in and walk through. Yeah, it absolutely was. There were not all spaces. There were private areas in the building you couldn't go to, the family quarters and the political quarters, but a lot of the rooms were just for show. And they wanted people to come through to see it. What I'd like to talk about now is French. Let's see if this helps. Can you all no see? It's just there's no sun and it's just too dark in here. I know, but I can't see my notes.
Maybe up here. Maybe if I open this a little bit. It's still not gonna help. Yeah, you need to go. Yeah.
That may be good enough.
Okay, whatever.
As long as you can see better. Well, this is fine for me. Yeah, I can see my notes. I just needed a little bit more. If it were a sunny day, I probably could have. Well, it's almost a sunny day, but you can see it a little bit better. Of all of the locations in Europe during the 17th century, I'd already mentioned that French Baroque art, if you want to use that term, is different from everywhere else, because the French will never embrace the drama and emotion of the Counter-Reformation. The French were Catholic, but they do not embrace the call of the church for drama and theater. And they don't because of personal taste. The French simply don't like that. They don't like open displays of emotion. They didn't then, and they don't now. They're a very reserved people, they're a formal people, and they will always embrace classicism, which is the opposite of drama and emotion. Classicism, going back to Greek art, reserved emotions, not showy. And so French Baroque art, French art of the 17th century, is generally referred to as French classicism. Sometimes people call it French Baroque. This is where it comes into play as to what you mean by Baroque. If you mean a style, then this isn't Baroque. If you mean 17th century, then you can call it that. French art historians would never use the word Baroque. They simply call it French classicism or French 17th century art. And I prefer to think of it as French classicism. And we'll do some comparisons and it'll be clearer. The most important artist of the 17th century in France and the most influential was Nicolas Poussin. Poussin continues to be for centuries the primary figure that the French look to. He lays the foundation for classical art. This is his landscape with St. Matthew and the Angel. We've already seen that landscape paintings are developing. And this is what's called the classical landscape. There are many different types of landscape that we're going to talk about, especially when we get to the 19th century. This is the foundation of what's called the classical landscape. It's a very formulaic style, and classicism in general is fairly formulaic. In this case, he's constructing a sort of artificial space. There's nothing natural about classical art. It's very constructed. It's very artificial. In this case, we see the trees on two sides framing the scene. So you see two like it's a proscenium stage set, and you get the two trees on each side, and then you get something in the background, usually a mountain, hills, or large building that stops your view. So it's sort of carving out the space like a little box theater set. And then there are usually forms that work diagonally to draw your eye back. Generally, it's a pathway or a river. You can see these diagonals, your eye enters, and then these diagonals sort of draw your eye back, and then you're stopped when you see the mountains in the background. That's sort of the classical motif of a landscape, and it's very artificial. They're never depictions of what a real space looks like. It's a sense of nature that is sort of controlled by man. Every tree grows where you want it to grow. Every hill rises where you need it to. It's not a natural sense of nature. It's a man-controlled nature. The reference to little ruins down here is significant. It's sort of a classical reference. I'm going to talk more in a minute about this idea of ruins and ruined buildings, because that's even bigger in the 18th century and early 19th century as a style, as a sort of nostalgic style. Typically, the center of this area of a classical landscape will have water. A water source. It's always calm. There's never going to be any waves or storms or anything like that. This is the closest we get to, and he is still influenced by the Venetian landscape. He is still influenced by Titian. So you're going to see a bit of that Venetian sky, but it's not stormy or wild in any way. He paints in a very linear fashion. He's rejecting those larger painterly brushstrokes that we saw other Baroque painters using. He's rejecting that because those are more emotional. He's going back to the linear, tiny little smooth surfaces. So all of the things that we think of as classical is what Poussin is doing here. Now, what we see is actually a biblical scene, landscape with St. Matthew and the angel. So what is it? Is it a biblical painting? Would you call this a religious painting, or would you call this a landscape? He's blurring the boundaries, and he's doing that very intentionally because of the period that he's working in. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But let me show you first one other French landscape, and then we'll talk about that subject. And this is a landscape by Claude de Lorraine. The Nelson has 3 or 4 really, their 17th century collection is, I think, the strongest collection in the entire museum. If there's one thing they have in abundance, it's 17th century art. That's their strongest point. They have everything. And that's one of the things I love about the Nelson is this collection, but they have some beautiful French landscapes of this period. Claude de Lorraine, or sometimes he's increasingly, I see him just listed as Claude Lorraine. It's really Claude de Lorraine. He was from Lorraine in eastern or central and eastern France. He was the foremost landscape painter. Poussin was the foremost painter. He did landscapes, portraits, religious, he did all sorts of things. But just as a pure landscape painter, Claude is the most famous. He was often copied and faked. People tried to fake his work and sell it off. He kept a notebook he called the Liber Veritas, which means the book of truth. And he had a little drawing in it of every painting that he ever made. This was like his sort of copyright book. He could look it up and, you know, prove that that's not one of his, because he was being ripped off so much that he kept his little book. But he was the master. He really, I think, is the one who laid down the foundation for this classical landscape. Mill on the Tiber, framing, mountain in the back, still water, diagonals that lead your eye back, calm sky. You can see it's a checklist. I can give you here's the 10 points. You do these 10 things and you will have the perfect classical painting. Now, there are problems with that kind of art, as we're going to see in a moment. And again, we get little figures. It's not a biblical story. It's sort of, you know, just sort of peasants. It's a type of painting. It's the beginning of a type of painting that's going to be real popular in the 18th century. I call it the sort of happy peasant painting, where there are scenes of sort of peasants in the countryside, and it's always sort of idyllic. There's something ideal about it, and wow, what a wonderful life the peasants have in this country, and poor people really haven't made, but it's always like that. You know, it's like you can look at it and, you know, you don't have to worry about them or think about them, because look, they got a beautiful life. So it's a way of looking at the world that validates a certain social structure. And these were really popular. Happy peasant paintings were really popular, obviously, among the wealthy, the elite, because that's who paintings are made for. Now, what's beginning about this time that I want to talk about in more detail is the existence and the power of the academies. Now, France is not the only place that has an academy that is founded in the 17th century. Academy of St. Luke, I think, predates the French Academy a little bit. That's in Italy. Germany is going to have a couple of academies. We're going to talk more about the academic system when we get into the 19th century, because it plays a really important role in art. But this is when it's beginning in the 17th century. When it's founded in France, it's called the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, founded in 1648. We just usually call it the French Academy, but that's its full name. It's under royal patronage. It was an early attempt to really limit stylistic choices, to control the nature of what art should be, what defined French art. And it was quite restrictive early on. It was meant to be. There were originally 40 members, and there were always only 40 members. And you couldn't become a member till somebody died. I mean, when somebody died, there's an opening, and then someone else is elected. It's a very hard thing to get into. Now, what is the academy, and what do we mean by this sort of academic system? The academy functioned in a lot of ways. It's a whole new thing. It's different from the guilds, but it functions similar to the guilds in that it sort of controls art in a way. And you need to be affiliated with it to be a professional artist. One of the things that it did was offer the annual salon, or what's called the French salon. For the first several years, for quite a while, it was every 2 years, and then it became annual. So we just think of it as the annual salon. That's an exhibition. It's the big exhibition every year, lasted about 2 months in the Louvre. Which was not, the Louvre Palace was really used by the Academy. At this point, once the the palace moved out to Versailles, the building, the Louvre building, was sort of owned by the Academy, and all of those rooms were studios for the members, etc. It's also, many of the rooms is where the Salon exhibition was held every year. It didn't become a museum until Napoleon takes power. So it's not until a bit later Napoleon turns it into a museum, but that's really where the French collection was housed, the French state collection. So holding that exhibition was very important. You needed to be in that exhibition, and that exhibition was very, very controlled by those who ran the Academy. They determined who got in it, determined who gets the commissions. I mean, you know, if you want a career, you need to get into that show. To get into that show, you need to work in a certain style, a certain way. So you can see how it controlled the nature of art. You just didn't have a chance to have a career. I mean, there wasn't a legal requirement that you work in a classical style, but you had very little chance of having a successful career if you didn't. And so people just did. They worked in the style they needed to. The other thing the Academy did was they had a school, the École, and the École, the school, was largely for young men. Of course, all this is primarily for men, but we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Certainly the École was generally from your late teens through your mid-20s, you might be at the École. There was also developed in line with that a whole system of private and sort of preparatory art schools that would prepare you for the exams, that would get you into the official École, and then that made your career so that you could get into the Academy. So you're sort of trained at every step in a certain way to sort of work through your career. Hand in hand with the École as an education, and the school itself taught very specific things. They primarily taught drawing. Drawing was, since they were classical artists, they favored a linear style, which meant drawing was the foundation of all French art. So all they taught in the École was drawing, and they would draw from cast. First, they would draw from paintings. They would draw from plaster casts of like ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. They had a huge collection of plaster casts. They also drew from the human figure, the male figure, and that's all they taught. If you wanted to learn painting, you didn't learn it in the École. You learned that through the atelier system. An atelier just means a studio, literally translated. But as a system, it was really part of the whole art institution. All of the sort of master artists, those 40 members of the Academy and other artists as well, have their own sort of working studios. An atelier is a working teaching studio. It's not just my studio, but I'm going to have students around me who work as my assistants, but I'm also training them. So it plays the role that the guilds used to play in terms of having people working at different levels and learning their craft as part of the process. So if you're a student, you're taking classes at the École, but you're also affiliated with a particular prominent artist, an important artist, and you're learning painting from them. And that's all simultaneously happening. And that's sort of the whole system. Built into that system were system of competitions. Is that light reflecting on the screen for you at all? Is it?
No.
It's not bothering you? Okay. Because it is for me, but it doesn't matter because I have it right here. As long as you can see it, that's all that matters. Systems of competitions. The whole thing was very, very competitive. Very competitive tests just to get into the school. That's why they had prep schools that prepared you for that. Then there were, you know, just to get into, once you get into the academy, you had, or the academy school, you had to undergo exams to get into every class. You know, to get into this class, you have exams, etc. There were even exams to determine where you got to sit in the classroom. So if you wanted to sit up here, you had to have the better grades on the exam. I mean, it was like that. It was all competition. And there were competitions in every type of art. There were just hundreds of competitions. The most famous competition, the most important competition was the Prix de Rome, or the Rome Prize. They set up a fairly early on, just before this, I forget the exact date, doesn't matter, I guess. But they set up a French Academy in Rome, and French students could go down and live and study there in Rome. Rome was the place you wanted to go, because remember, they're studying classical art. They want to go to Rome. They want to look at the ruins, the Roman sculptures, the architectural ruins. So Rome was where you wanted to go. So the Rome Prize, these were for the most senior students every year. And I won't go into the complications of the Rome Prize, which has all of its own different levels. And the whole process every year took 103 days. From beginning to end, the process of awarding that prize took like 1/3 of an entire year. That's how complicated it was. But if you won that, you could win 5 or 6, it varied, years free in Rome. You know, you go to Rome, they pay for everything, you study there, it makes your career. Plus, just winning it means, you know, your career is set. So everyone wants to win the Rome Prize. And there were different Prix de Rome's prizes. There was like one for landscape, but the most prestigious was for history painting, because they established from the beginning a hierarchy within the academy and within the school, a hierarchy of subject matter. And when you entered either the school or tried to apply as an academician, you entered in a specific category, and everything you did was that type of art. History painting was number one. Everyone wanted to be admitted as a history painter. Everyone wanted that. History painting included not really history, because there really wasn't that much painting dealing with history at this point. What they meant was narrative art. Basically, it meant religious art or scenes from mythology. That's largely what history painting was. It's hard for people to understand it today, but you have to remember that the French word histoire doesn't mean history. Histoire doesn't mean history, it means story. So what they really mean by history painting is narrative art, storytelling. That was the highest form. And everybody wanted to be admitted in that category because that set your career down a certain path.
If we looked up the winners of the Prix de Rome, would we recognize all of those names? Were those artists?
No.
They weren't good.
Because our sense of who, no, and it's not because you wouldn't recognize who were the greatest artists 100 years ago based on what they thought and what we thought. Our views change. There was a big competition in around 1890, where they sat down and said, who do you think in 100 years everyone's going to remember as the most important artist of our age? And they wrote down all these names, and you go down those names and you don't know a single one of them. It's not any of the people that we think were the greatest artists of the 1890s. So no, our views of history in general change.
But you'd think technically they'd be technically good artists.
They were technically good artists, and we can look at that and recognize they were technically good artists, but we don't value technique today in the same way they value technique. Everything was technique then, which is interesting because we're going to talk about what they valued, what they looked at, especially when we come back to the 19th century a little later, because that's really where it all comes into play. So I'll go back into a lot of that again. So second important is portraits, because portraits are going to be of important people and they're important, so they're next down. Third, landscape. Fourth, still life in that hierarchy. So if you're a landscape painter and you want to elevate your art, you historiate it. This is what's called a historiated landscape. It's a landscape, but there's a narrative in it. There's a story going on here, and that automatically elevates that landscape to being something more important than just the land. So this is why, as landscapes become more popular, you start seeing like little people and little stories, because that elevates it in people's eyes. That's a more important painting because there's some people in there. And then the most important is if you put a little biblical scene down here, you can't even really see it. You just call it something. That makes it even more important, because now it's an even more important historiated landscape. So that's what we begin to see. Once you have a hierarchy, you have people trying to manipulate those hierarchies and trying to sort of elevate what they do. Now, as we move into the 18th century, so this starts 1648. 1648, the Academy's founded, and it's founded on the style of Nicolas Poussin. Everybody worked like Nicolas Poussin. That's the rule of the Academy. And everybody was working really hard to paint just like Poussin through the last half of the 17th century. But that generation is shifting. By the end of that century, when we come to 1700, which is the beginning of the 18th century, technically 1701 is the beginning of the 18th century, we've got another generation of artists, a bunch of younger artists who come along who are tired of the limitations, the formulas they have to follow, and there's a rebellion. There's a sort of minor rebellion in the French Academy at the beginning of the 18th century, and it's inspired by one particular series of paintings that these younger artists sort of discover. It's a series of paintings that were not on view in the Louvre, but were in the private palace, the private Luxembourg Palace, which had been the private palace of the Queen at the time. And that series of paintings, commissioned by Marie de Medici, is the series on the left that we looked at. Remember those paintings that she commissioned Rubens for? She went outside of France to get a non-French painter because she didn't want this classical stuff. She was Italian. She wanted the passionate Baroque style, not the dispassionate French intellectualism. So she goes to Rubens. The French didn't like it, so they just left him in her little palace. Well, 50 years later, 60 years later, here comes along a younger generation of French artists who see all this stuff. They've had it up to here with classicism. They want some drama. They want some emotion. And here's a model. Here's all this stuff by Rubens. And so these debates begin in the French Academy at the beginning of the century. It's known as the debate of the Rubenists versus the Poussinists. Those young people who favor the style of Rubens, or in other words, drama and emotion, versus those younger artists who want to continue the classical style of Poussin. Those are the Poussinists. Now, remember, Rubens and Poussin are dead. We're 18th century now. This is long past those two actual artists. They, in fact, liked each other and liked each other's works. There was no conflict between them just because they worked differently. The conflict is in a later generation looking back at their work and arguing for change. And they make an interesting parallel. You can clearly see the difference. Rubens is rich, it's painterly, it's colorful, it's very dynamic, there's movement, swirling forms, where Poussin is still and intellectual and quiet. It's just total opposites in terms of approaches. Now, who do you think is going to win this debate and why?
Rubens.
The Rubenists win, yes. Why?
Because they've done this for so many years and they're ready for something new.
It's less restrictive.
It's less restrictive, but why does a younger generation always win a debate?
They live longer.
Competition dies.
There is eventually a critical mass of fewer and fewer people defending the old style and more demanding the new. It's just a matter of wait long enough. Yeah, it's just life. It's going to happen, and it does. And in fact, when this painting in 1717 was accepted for membership in the Academy, it marked the victory of the Rubenese, because this is a style unlike anything ever accepted within the Academy. It's a style called Rococo, and Rococo is one of many different styles that were happening in the 18th century. It's the style that was popular among the aristocrats of that century, very popular. This would have been popular at among those living at Versailles in the 18th century. It's called Rococo. Now, the problem is it doesn't fit any of the 4 standard categories. It's not really a landscape. Excuse me. You can't call it a historiated landscape because the people are a little too big and there's a little clearly too much of a narrative here. It's also a sort of fantasy scene. It's not biblical. It's not referencing mythology. These are contemporary people, but it's not actually a historical event. It doesn't really fit anywhere. So they invented a new category called the fête galante. And that literally just translates as a sort of festive gathering or an elegant gathering. And they were very popular scenes. It's French aristocrats, and they tend to be very, very escapist scenes, escapist subjects. This is painted by Jean-Antoine Watteau. Watteau is certainly one of the earliest of the very successful Rococo painters. Pilgrimage to the island of Kythera. Kythera does come from Greek mythology. Kythera was a mythic Greek island where it was the island of Venus, where time stood still. So lovers would escape to Kythera and time would stand still for them there. That's in Greek mythology. But he's got 18th century men and women dressed here, clearly not Greek gods and goddesses. And they're getting up because it's time to go. And there's a ship down here in the harbor, and the little cupids here sort of telling them it's escapist. It's like they've escaped away with their lovers. Now, this was popular at Versailles because of the lives they lived. Remember, we talked about life at Versailles and how people, marriages were arranged and their lives were controlled. So it was not uncommon at all, perfectly acceptable for people to have lovers. I mean, yeah, you're married to this person because, that's political. You have to do that. Doesn't mean you have to love them. You can have your own, real love interest out there. So that's the escapism. It's like all the little things at Versailles with, people sneaking out to meet their lovers. I mean, this is the perfect subject for them because they've gone to the island. There's something sad about it. There's something nostalgic about it. Time is up now. We have to go back to our lives, back to the real world, and it's over with. And the fact that subjects like this were so popular at Versailles and among the aristocracy in general speaks a lot about lives. And I mentioned last time about, how the sort of peasants thought the aristocracy had everything, and the aristocracy thought the peasants had everything because they were free and could do what they wanted to. And it's those extreme differences that lead to revolution, which is why I warn people, we are living in a world that is building to revolution. When you see the extremes that we have, the more extremes and the less people see, quote, the other as a human being, you're walking down a path. If people would study history and understand human nature, they would recognize, you've all heard, those who don't study history are doomed to live it again. I mean, it's so true. And it's so frustrating to people that do know history to just watch it unfolding in front of them, and you can't do anything about it. But anyway, this is very influenced by Rubens, the loose brushwork, the feathery, the thicker paint. There's nothing linear here. It's very dynamic. It's very ephemeral. But you would never confuse this with a 17th century painting, however. This is very light. They favored light pastel colors. They worked on a light ground as opposed to a dark ground. Most 17th century Baroque painters painted from a dark ground and built up. And there was a depth and a weightiness to what they did. This is very light, very ephemeral. And that's why a lot of people don't like it. It's seen as sort of effete and sort of frivolous, because I mean, after all, that's a pretty frivolous subject, but it's also a very serious subject because it tells you about their lives, and that's serious. It's not as sort of, it doesn't lack, I think, seriousness. I think people misunderstand a lot about Rococo art. Later in the century, this is another painting that tells a similar story. Fragonard, the swing, the original artist, and I don't know who that was, but there was originally another artist who got the commission, but he didn't want to do it because he said it was too sexually explicit. And so Fragonard took it up and does the scene. So what we have, again, is this sort of fantasy, escapist sort of garden. You could almost envision this as sort of the gardens at Versailles or something like that. And the young lady is out walking with, this is identified as the older gentleman back here who's sort of pushing her in this swing, but hiding down here in the bushes is her lover, the younger man, and she knows he's there. She's kicking her leg up so he can peek up under her skirt and kicking off her shoe. So it's a joke, you know, so it obviously you could see this as frivolous, you could see it as immoral, and it will very much be attacked on those grounds very shortly. We're just right before the revolution. And it's paintings like this that are feeding into that immorality of the aristocracy, etc. And you've got Cupid here, sculptures of Cupid who's going, you know, don't tell anybody, and they're all watching. So it's a big joke in a way, but it's a beautiful painting, very feathery and light-hearted, and very much a very specific moment in time for a very specific audience. The 18th century is important because it's a transitional century. This is the century you can teach two ways. And I taught where I taught, I had the modern, I did the advanced courses in modern. So I started in the 18th century, picking up with the birth of the modern world in the 18th century. My other colleague, I had another colleague who taught Renaissance and Baroque, and he also taught 18th century, but he taught the part of it that was the end of the earlier part. So he taught Rococo while I was teaching other things that were happening at the same time. It depends whether it's the last gasp of an older style or the beginning of a newer style. And the 18th century has both. It's a century that engenders change. And this is really that last voice that really is going to spark that change. So let's talk about the Enlightenment, because that's what we're talking about is happening here in the 18th century. And Kendall talks about the Enlightenment a lot.
Common people have access to looking at art like this, or it was
No.
Okay, it was just representative of the feelings of it.
Okay, they did in theory, they did. It was, I forget the date, somewhere in here I have the date, when they first proposed that it was in the 18th century, that the art at the salon, it was very, okay, the salon exhibitions from the very beginning were open primarily during the day. They weren't open at night or on weekends. If you're wealthy, that's fine. But it pretty much excluded working people from ever going there. And when they first proposed that the salons stay open on weekends, that was extremely controversial, because then like anybody can come and look at it. And that there's something that happens again in the 19th century like that. There's a kind of a fear of having middle class or working class people looking at art. it's a different fear in France than it is in England. We'll talk about it when we get to England, because in England, it's a different issue as to why. But in general, no, these aren't places where they felt welcome. Even if they could physically go, they weren't dressed right or welcome there, and probably had very little interest in doing so. It's the 19th century with the Romantic movement, as we'll see, where art begins to reach out for the first time to a middle class, and it changes dramatically because of that. But we're not there yet. So the Enlightenment, intellectual and cultural movement, you see it in many different forms, particularly through the encyclopedists, the logistes as they're known, or the encyclopedists in France, the attempt to document knowledge, organize knowledge. So many of the things we take for granted are ideas from the Enlightenment. The fact that we have reference books, we can look things up, that ideas are logically organized. A new emphasis on reason, at a totally different level. Mostly the importance was in the questioning. It was about asking questions for the first time in many ways. Mainly the question was, why? Why does it have to be this way? Why is it that way? Why do everything? And then, by the end of the century, the question gets around to, why do you get to have all the power and money? Why do I not? I mean, it's, when you have people starting to ask those questions, eventually they're going to get to questions like equality and the like. And this is the birth of a democratic world, the modern era. It was often framed in terms of natural versus artificial, in terms of behaviors. And again, there are many different philosophers, Rousseau's contributions and Diderot's contributions, and you could do a whole college degree in the Enlightenment, let alone a whole seminar class in it. But for our purposes, many of the questions centered around what's natural. What's the natural way to do this? What's the natural way for people to interact and to behave versus artificial? Because they saw the aristocracy's life as artificial, imposed upon them, and it was artificial. And that's one of the things they're going to turn against. This is also where the idea of progress begins, which is an essential philosophical foundation of the modern world. It's a concept that we don't think about, we accept without thinking that there is a such thing as progress, although I think it's being questioned today, whether there is a such thing as progress. But it was the foundation of the modern world, the assumption that things change, and things change for the better, because that's what progress means. Progress doesn't mean change, it means change for the better. And if it's not change for the better, it's not progress, it's just change. So that's going to feed into ideas that will establish an avant-garde later. Basically that philosophical idea of the movement of human society to higher levels of development. And if you're interested in philosophy, I would read Hegel in the 18th century. Hegel's dialectic, his discussion of the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He laid down a philosophical foundation for how change happens. And he said, first of all, there's an idea, a belief, an idea. Someone postulates a concept, and then someone else comes along and says the opposite of it. No, just the opposite. And out of that conflict comes change, a new thing, which is a synthesis of the two. And that new thing then is the new thesis. And then its antithesis comes along. And so it's a spiral of change. I'm defining progress. I'm defining that concept of change through conflict, and that becomes the model that defines how we see the world from the 18th century on. It's the foundation for the modernism, for the avant-garde, for our whole beliefs about how we believe the world works. We'll talk about that in the 19th century more, because more into my area. So what is this? How does this affect art in general? 18th century artists who are influenced by the Enlightenment are going to do one of these four things. They're going to talk about the way things are, and they're going to disparage it. They're going to say, here's what's happening, and that's really a bad thing. I mean, that's one way. All these depend on your point of view and who you're speaking to, which of these you embrace. Or they might talk about the way things are, and they're going to say, yeah, this is really great. So that depends sort of which side you're on. Do you criticize? I can show the aristocracy and criticize it, or I can show them and validate it. Or you can look at different behaviors, or they're going to show someone behaving in a proper way, and they're going to show it positively. You're rewarded because you're behaving properly. Or they're going to show bad behavior, and they're going to show you being punished for your bad behavior. This is what I refer to as Enlightenment moralizing art. Moralizing art is when someone's it's didactic. They're trying to teach you a lesson. And we see a lot of that in the 18th century on every side. We especially see it, one of the most famous artists who works in this area is British. And I want to turn our attention to Britain for a little while, because the British were, in fact, much freer to comment on and attack and speak of their aristocracy than the French were, because the British did not have an absolute monarchy, right? They've had the Magna Carta for hundreds of years, so they're perfectly free to make fun of their aristocrats. You don't do that in France before the revolution, because the aristocrats there still had, power. The aristocracy did. So the British are going to do more commenting about aristocratic behavior. And Hogarth is by far the most famous. He is known for doing many scenes on this subject. He often worked in prints and series. This is a print on one of 6. Well, this is actually the painting, but he also did the scenes as prints. There were 6 scenes that were printed, so there would be multiple copies, so they would go to the middle class. Remember prints? Prints are multiples. They're on paper, so they're cheaper, so they're widely dispersed. So if you're doing this kind of commentary, you want wide dispersal, the ideas, and you want it so that middle class people can buy them. So he does paintings, but he also does those paintings in print form so they can be widely dispersed. This happens to be the painting, because the prints would have been black and white, of course, but this is the painting. And this is the first in a series of 6. The series is called Marriage a la Mode, or a stylish marriage is what that means. And it's the marriage contract. This is a type of painting that the British absolutely love. The British love what we call anecdotal art. It's a very British thing. You don't see it anywhere else. They loved art that they could sit and look at and just dissect, that they could look at every little detail, and every little thing is symbolic of something and means something. It's a little anecdote. They're sometimes referred to as conversation pieces, which means they were meant to initiate a conversation on some sort of controversial issue or idea. Now, in this one, it's the whole subject of the series is arranged marriage. It's a comment on the artificiality of arranged marriage. And so it's the series eventually ends in murder and suicide and the downfall of a family, by the end. But this is the first one. So it's still fairly lighthearted here in the first scene. So what we've got, and the British would have understood all this symbolism. They were used to reading paintings like this. We have, first of all, Lord Squanderfield is his name. That's his name. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole written story that goes with the paintings that describes the people. So lest you not understand what's going on here, it was easily readable and to the British. And this is his son over here on the left, this sort of effete man. And this is the young girl from a merchant class family. This is her father here in this coat. And they're arranging the marriage between them. Now, the reason is because this was rampant in Britain at the time. These very wealthy old families were going bankrupt. Many of them, you can see out the window, the family manor is falling apart. There's scaffolding in front of it. He doesn't have the money. The building's falling down. They needed influx of cash. And the merchants while not that educated and sophisticated, is clearly shown, he's got a heck of a lot more money. Merchants were beginning to make more money. So he's got a dowry, and there's a pile of gold here that he's brought for his daughter. So this is a very common match. It's not unlike the match between, Henry and Marie de Medici, where, one group has one thing, another group has another. Usually it's the bride who brings the money to a faltering lineage in the man's family. And he's over here boasting of their lineage. He's got a family tree here going all the way back to the Knights of the Crusades. So he's very proud of their family line. The son over here has no interest whatsoever in anything that's going on. This is anything but yeah, probably. I can't see what it is, but probably is, because there are references to card. He's out gambling at night all the time. He's got, you can kind of see this dark splotch here on his neck. That's a reference to syphilis, that he probably has syphilis. That he's out, squandering all the money. All these things on the wall are references to the squandering of the money. These are, elaborate French frames, and they always make fun of the French. They always put elaborate, expensive French things sitting around. So spending all of their money. This is, what's his name? He's got an interesting name too, the lawyer, Silvertongue. Whoops. This is Silvertongue, the lawyer. They're having a thing actually as well. This is the poor notary. This is the architect who's out there trying to figure out how much money he needs to save the building. And then you have lots of little signs. His foot is up. He has gout. Gout was seen as a symbol of overindulgence, eating rich foods, etc. You've got something that's dropped here to the floor. That's a symbol of disarray. There are a lot of symbols here that say this household is in bad shape. Not only things on the wall, but the inattentive dogs. Always watch for dogs. Dogs can be very positive if they're alert and they symbolize domesticity. These dogs aren't paying any attention. They're inattentive. That's also a sign of a house that's not right, not well. I must say, this 18th century collection of art from around was scandalous in the 18th century. And it's one of the things that led to a lot of these wealthy families going bankrupt. They would go on these long tours, the Grand Tour, and they would buy all this art in France and Italy. And it was well known that the British were being sold anything and everything. They were sold, they didn't know anything about art, and they were buying whatever. So they were told this was a Raphael and this is a Leonardo, and so they were just wasting money. And it was so bad in the 18th century that they had this need for experts. There was no experts out there in art. And so a whole expertise developed in art of people who knew enough about art that they could come in and examine these collections. It was the beginning of what we call connoisseurship, which is a branch of art history. So my discipline begins. We wouldn't be here today if they hadn't done this, because it's the British buying all this art that led to the birth of art history, the beginning of experts knowing about art, and particularly connoisseurship, which today is a small branch of art history, but it was the whole thing at the time. So, I am indebted to them. So it's a powerful statement, and it's clearly for a particular audience. This isn't made for the aristocrats. This is for a middle class who, or mostly it's for an intelligentsia. It's more of an intelligentsia class. We don't use that word a lot in Western art outside of the sort of Russian tradition, but there is an intelligentsia class. It's not merchant class, because they're making fun of the merchant here just as much as they're making fun of the aristocrat. But it's the culture itself. It's challenging what is the right way, what is the natural way for marriages, and increasingly arranged marriages are being criticized, that this isn't natural, and it's going to lead to not only the downfall of an old family, which, it's not the arranged marriage that did that. It was the ridiculous spending of money and not paying attention to what you were doing. But in the end, of course, people dying and everything going wrong. So if you want to look up more in that series, just look up the Marriage a la mode, and you can see the whole series of them. But we also
talk us through all 18.
No, there's only 6 of these, only 6. And I only really know well the first one and the last one, but mostly the first one I know better than others. So this is challenging class and privilege, which you don't do openly yet in France, but that's very much an Enlightenment thing. But some artists also reaffirm class and privilege. In England, that matters. And in England, that's tied to the land in a way that is different from anywhere else in the Western world. Because Great Britain is an island, it's a small island. Their aristocrats' relationship to the land in Britain is unlike anywhere else because of the limitations of the land. It's little of it, and that connection to it is powerful. And so being connected to that land matters. This is a strange painting when you look at it. So again, what is it? Is it a portrait? Is it a landscape? Gainsborough made his career on reaffirming for the British aristocrats their position as proprietors of the land. The British relationship to the land is really special. Not only is it so important because there's so little land, but also the way they saw themselves. I mean, it couldn't be more different than the American. I just hate so many things about America. I hate to say that, but it's true. It's true. I do. There are so many things that are just wrong with this country. And one of them is our sense of property, our sense of, I own this, I can do whatever I want, and the hell with you. And there's a problem with that. It's self-centered, it's selfish, and it ignores societal needs, and it's all me, me, me. And the British don't feel that way about land. These families that have had this land, that are lords of the manor, they always saw themselves as proprietors of the land. They always felt an obligation to that land, like they were caretakers of it. And that's why it was scandalous if they sold it off. I mean, you didn't do that. You kept it together. You were the proprietors, and they took pride in that because that land defined their position. So he's reaffirming them in that. He's giving them an image that says this is right, that you should be here, that you should be in charge of the land. Now, he's doing that in a very strange portrait. It looks odd. I mean, if I had cut off the whole right half, it would look like a fairly normal portrait of a man and his wife. But that's not the painting. It is the whole painting. And there are things here that would be hard for us to understand because I don't necessarily understand that much about farming at the time. But there are some very new progressive farming techniques that are evident here in the right side of the picture. It's very telling of how he is a good proprietor of the land. He is a good farmer. He knows the latest techniques. And he knows how to farm the land to get the most from the land. It's also a new idea. He has to separate the sheep and the cows. I grew up on a farm, but I never heard anything about separating sheep and not cows, but horses and sheep, because we never had horses or sheep. We just had cows and pigs. But apparently you're not supposed to put sheep and horses in the same pasture. This was a new idea, and I don't remember why, but it was sort of progressive farming. So he intentionally shows the sheep over here and the horses over here, and they're separated. So when you look at this, you see a man in casual clothes, not the formal portraits that you would have seen 50 years earlier, in very formal garb. She's even dressed fairly informally. Out in the land. This is as much a portrait of the land as it is of them. And it's sort of uniting the two, like the land and the people are one. So that, every time, and now we've got the attentive dog. Look at the attentive dog. The attentive dog is telling us that all things are well. And so they're meant to look casual. Every time they see this painting in their home, they're reminded that it's right and it's good that I own all this stuff and that I am the lord of the manor. The sort of coded messages in paintings like this were very important. Yeah.
That philosophy, I think, comes through in Downton Abbey too. The family is very much concerned about their.
Yeah, you definitely see it through in the 19th, you see it even up into the 20th century in Britain. Yeah.
The reason they separate the sheep and the cattle is because sheep will eat the grass down and pull the roots out too. They will totally restore it.
Okay.
So if you
So
change it
other
back and
animals,
forth,
yeah, it makes sense. That's probably, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But something about this agriculture here is a different technique, a new kind of farming technique that he wants to show you he knows. So this is also Enlightenment moralizing. It's taking a point of view, a moral stance on class and privilege and making a statement about it, just the opposite of the one we just saw. But Gainsborough is really known for his portraits, and I just quickly wanted to show you a couple of them. They're beautiful portraits, but if you don't know the subtext here, you'll miss the politics of paintings like this, because this is also very much the same thing. These are aristocratic women, although especially the one on the right, she's married to the playwright Sheridan, and they were part of a sort of a liberal intelligentsia circle, but he would put them in the land because they are of the land. You know, this is not your traditional 3/4 length, half length, 3/4 view, right? That's what we saw in previous centuries. This is a full figure in the land, which tells you that land is part of the portrait. So again, the brushwork he uses for her hair, which is blowing in the wind, is the same brushwork as the tree. He's just merging these two figures. I think the one on the right is a better painting and does it a little bit more, but she is also in the land. And typically these are recognizable places. These are the actual lands that we see. So Gainsborough, a master of portraits, for this particular message. Okay, now in France, we get more subtle moralizing messages. In this case, this is sort of reaffirming moral behavior within the class structure, the governess. Now, I want to talk about the governess theme a bit. We'll see more governess images in the 19th century. Themes of the governess are very popular, particularly in British literature. And I'm thinking of Jane Eyre and all of those stories about the English governesses. And there are more in the 19th century in painting. The governess played a really interesting role within the political dynamics of a household, because governesses typically came from an upper class. They were young women who were well educated. They typically came from an upper class family that was in straits, generally because a father has died. Their traditional income has died, and they in need of money, but they're not working class women. They're not going to work in factories or whatever. So governess job was one of the few I'm not going to say respectable, I'm going to say mostly respectable positions that a woman could have as a job at this time. But there were still problems with the governess role, because in a household, she was neither family nor servant. She couldn't interact with the servants downstairs, but she couldn't really interact with the family upstairs. She's in this intermediate role. They were also, as depicted in literature and in art, were often very vulnerable because they were young women without protectors. The whole point is there's no father or older brother to take care of them, which is why they have to go out and work. If they had an older male relative, they wouldn't need to be working. So they're in a position where they're vulnerable to the other people in that household, and particularly the, you know, the master of the house. And they're in a difficult position in a number of ways. They're also in a difficult position because they're expected to raise and reprimand and teach the young children who are themselves aristocrats of a higher status and are very aware that they're of a higher status. And so how do you balance that? How do you teach a young boy that you can't really reprimand too much? And, you know, they also have their role. So this is not just showing her behavior as positive, it's showing his behavior as positive, because he also has to learn that's his job to learn, and that he's going to, you know, step up as well someday and be lord of the manor. So paintings like this are very influenced by genre scenes, or those Dutch genre scenes where you have sort of middle-class people, you know, the water carrier, and we saw other Dutch genre scenes, but those were mostly middle-class people. These aren't really middle-class people, neither of these. So that's not exactly the same. So we don't call it a genre scene, but it's certainly influenced by them. It's more moralizing than most genre scenes, but we know that the Dutch genre scenes were moralizing too, because they were speaking about work, ethic, and the like. So this is primarily about sort of the benevolent exercise of authority. So the young boy has left his toys lying out, and he hasn't picked them up and put them away the way he should. And so she is stopping and reprimanding him, which is her duty. And he is looking contrite and looking down, and he's listening politely, which is his duty. So both of them are behaving properly. They're doing what they should. It's a quiet, small, intimate painting, as you can see, 18 by 15. You know, I talked last time a bit about the idea of scale in art, how smaller paintings, it came up with the Dutch because they were so small. We call them intimate. Intimate scenes in scale are of the scale that you experience them one at a time, one person at a time goes up and looks at the painting. So you have a certain relationship with that painting, but it also needs to be intimate in the subject. The subject can't be loud, and, you know, you don't do a grand battle scene that size. I mean, it makes no sense. It would look ridiculous. And that's part of the job of an artist, is understanding what scale a certain subject should be in order to make it work. And these are typically very good examples of intimate. Chardin is a wonderful painter. He's one of my favorite. He's a kind of painter's painter. He's a beautiful painter. There's a really nice Chardin in the Nelson Gallery. It's just a still life of the sort of fish hanging. It's in that 18th century room where nobody ever goes. There are like 3 18th century rooms way down at the end of that one hallway, and nobody ever goes down there. They might peek around and then go away, but we have some really nice 18th century paintings in there. And there's a beautiful Chardin. He's very influential on a lot of 19th century and even 20th century artists. So Chardin is very, very influential. So another interesting theme in art. Here's another interesting, very progressive subject, and Greuze made quite a living from doing scenes like this. It's sort of the continuation in some ways of the Happy Peasant scene, and yet it's different because it's picking up a different moralizing theme. It's related to them, and yet it's different. This is affirming working class morality. Now that is really shocking, actually, in the 18th century, because everybody knew the working class didn't have any morality. If you're poor, it's because you're an immoral person by definition. You know, that's where poverty comes from. It's because you deserved it. You know, you're not a good person, you're poor. So why should I give you money? You don't deserve it. So that's certainly the standard way people thought about class structure at the time. If you were privileged enough to have a lot of money, it's because you were a good moral person, and if you were poor, you were immoral. It was that simple. And in this case, he's sort of challenging that, and sort of, in a sense, playing on Hogarth's arranged marriage, because this is the opposite of it. This is a natural marriage in which we have the young man who's come to his fiance's family. He's meeting her father. He's bringing some money. He's bringing some money now to show that he has the money to take care of her. Clearly their arms are entwined. They are a love match. You know, they have chosen this. The family is all there. It's being done all upright. We have little symbols here like things like the hen and the little chicks down here, which are, you know, symbols of fertility and a new family that's being created, little things like that. This is a notary over here who's documenting the marriage. This is an actual marriage ceremony. They're saying the words. You didn't have to be married in a church. And in fact, there was a lot of sort of reaction against the control of the church at this time. They were kind of reacting against the power of the church to control everything. And it was legal as long as you had a notary that recorded the event and documented that this took place and can sign off on it. That was legal. So they're very intentionally not in a church, but they're doing it the right way. They're a natural match. And just to do that with a working class, that was really quite a powerful statement to make in 1761, and certainly would have been controversial. But you can see that people read these in different ways. I think if you were a wealthier person and you were familiar with the happy peasant paintings, you could probably look at this and not read into it too deeply and just see, oh, look, you know, yeah, they're poor, but they're happy, and accept it in that way. But if you were more a political person and you read more into it, you could see the sort of subtext of what's going on here, especially if you know someone like Hogarth or people who are criticizing the aristocratic arranged marriages and read it differently. So there are a lot of paintings that even at the time were being read and understood differently by different people depending on their political point of view. So proper behavior here, even if you're poor, you can still live a moral life, is sort of what he's saying. It does make an interesting comparison. I mean, I love these two, and I don't know if, you know, Greuze was familiar with Hogarth. Hogarth is very well known and widespread. He may very well have been sort of commenting on it, but then these ideas of natural and artificial were very well known as well. So again, in both cases, we get the aristocrats, but both of these are sort of show a changing point of view. In both of these, there are sort of statements about marriage, what is right, what is wrong, how should it happen.
What was the background of the painter who painted these?
Watteau?
Peasants, and do you know?
Well, all artists come from most artists come from an upper middle class background, always have. There are rare exceptions. Rarely do artists come from an aristocratic background. Aristocrats don't, that would have been below them. They don't work and have jobs, and they're not going to come from the working class, mostly middle class, but upper middle class is where artists almost always come from. Enough money to be able to get the education you need, but enough need to make money to go out and get commissions and build a career for yourself. So there's a little niche there. There are a few exceptions. There are a couple of aristocrat. I can think of one working class artist, and I can think of one aristocratic artist in the 19th century that stand out. That doesn't mean there aren't plenty more that I don't know about, but in my mind, that's the ones I know about. Okay, another theme, and one of my favorite interesting themes that was being discussed late in the century, was the theme of motherhood. You know, what is a good mother? And it comes up in all over in the Western world, but particularly in France, it was something that Marie Antoinette was criticized for constantly. There were constant criticism. Now, this is 2 years before the revolution is going to begin, and at this time, actually, she is more criticized than the king. Much of the polemic was criticizing the queen because she was foreign, she wasn't French. That's one of the main reasons. French never did like foreigners of any kind, and they never liked her. They always hated her. And so they started writing that, oh, she's just a bad mother. I mean, you know, there's just things in the air. There are things people talk about that people are discussing. It's interesting to try and see what that is for your own age. You know, the older you get, you can look back 20 and 25 years and begin to see how these narratives are sort of in the air of what people talk about. But the idea of, you know, how should you raise your children? What's good for society, what is natural and what is unnatural. Now, traditionally, the British, of course, hired nannies and brought them in, and they raised your children. You had a governess or a nanny, and that was it. You know, the children would be hauled out probably at the most once a day. You'd see them for a minute and pat them on the head. The French typically, however, French aristocrats typically sent their children away to be raised by again a nanny or governess, then usually in a small village. And so they would just be gone, and maybe they'd come and visit them once in a while. And this was being criticized quite openly at the time. And so, of course, she's going to be attacked. So because she was being attacked for this, she commissioned this painting from Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun was the first woman to be appointed king's painter. So a royal painter. She was a very successful woman portrait painter. She was the favorite portrait painter of both Marie and the king. So, you know, there are women out there that are, as I said before, as they were in the 17th century, who are having some very important careers, and Vigée-Lebrun was one of them. So she commissioned this portrait specifically to address this issue of her as a mother. This is meant to show her as a good mother, to contradict all those different criticisms. So we have the young Dauphin, the heir to the throne. So that would be Louis, would be Louis the 17th, but there was no Louis the 17th. Who rules, so he will never rule. But at this time, it was thought he would. She had just lost a child who died about at about the age of 2 or 3 months. That had just happened. So that's what that empty cradle there is signifying. She's holding another child, and then the daughter, the oldest daughter, but she wouldn't rule. So the boy would be in line to rule. Now, what do you think? Does it work? Does it convince you? Very stiff, very formal. First of all, this is really big, like 9'6" by 8 foot. So it's a big painting. That makes a difference too. That makes it more formal. Well,
She's overdressed.
she's very highly dressed in regalia. Now, I'm going to go ahead and defend Marie Antoinette. I feel that I have to do that quite a lot, actually. But I'm going to defend her because she had a kind of impossible task here. She was never going to pull this off. In fact, nobody bought this. They made fun of this painting even at the time it was painted. People thought it was, they saw the same things that you see now. They don't see a warm, nurturing mother. They see a cold, formal queen. But she was in a position where there was no precedent for her to be shown in any way other than the most formal queen. I mean, that's who she is. I mean, it just doesn't occur to anybody you don't show the Queen of France, the most important woman in the world, in some casual, you know.
And probably if they had, she'd have been criticized for that.
I mean, yeah, it would have been unthinkable. It would have diminished her power. She would have been attacked absolutely for that, I'm sure. And little things that I'm sure they thought were heartwarming don't come across that way. She seems to not be paying much attention to this child who seems to be about to fall. The little girl, I'm sure this was meant to look like a loving relationship, but it doesn't exactly. It looks like she's trying to get her attention, you know, or beg for attention. It doesn't come off right, but it's an impossible task in a way. At this moment in time, it was an impossible task. However, someone does figure it out. and that's Victoria. It's only 58 years. I had to stop and really get this in my mind. There's only 58 years between Marie Antoinette and Victoria. And yet in my mind, they're worlds apart, because one of them is at the end of one whole human era, and the other is at the beginning of a different era completely. And Victoria was all about, this is where they invented the idea of the royal family as the sort of mother and father of the nation. I mean, that's what she was. She was the mother of the nation. She and her press, and she had a big, press corps around her that were creating this image. But she figured out how to show herself as a mother and also the queen, because she really was the ruling queen. I mean, Marie wasn't. She was married to the king. Different. Victoria really was the actual queen. And yet she found ways, and she had artists working with her. It was a different world. First, it was Britain. It was a different world. They were not absolute monarchs. She didn't have that hanging over her head in the way the French did still at the time in 87 anyway. Yeah, I know, 2 generations. You think 58.
That way is
Right. It is a long time. When I think of history, though, 58 years is like a blink of an eye.
Right.
But when you think of it in terms of 2 generations and 2 different countries with 2 different histories,
Right.
that's relevant too. It's not just the time.
Mhm.
It is different in that way.
Technology speeds it up too.
And Victoria had photography and took advantage of photography as a way of showing her and her growing family. Now, this is very early. She's clearly quite young. I think they just have the one child. I don't remember how many they had, like eight, 9, 10, whatever, a lot eventually. But yeah, this is a family, an intimate scene. And I just find it an interesting parallel, the difficulties that the 2 of them had. Not that Victoria had difficulties, but how they solved their issues. So we go from 2 years before the revolution, when the portrait was painted, to the revolution itself. And the French Revolution is interesting. I would love to be able to spend a lot of time on it, but I don't have time to spend a lot of time on it. But nonetheless, it was something building for a very long time. It was a process that came out of the Enlightenment and the continuing questioning, with the excessive abuses and the just sort of the lavish spending of money, the total disregard of the plight of the working class and the middle class. All of it eventually leads to revolution. It's complicated in terms of the 3 estates vying for power. You had the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. The commoners are made up of a small middle class at this point and a large working class. That's going to change as we get into the 19th century. The 19th century is going to really expand the middle class. But much of the 19th century is going to be a conflict between the middle class and the working class, because the revolution is going to set the aristocrats aside. It's going to sort of remove a lot of power from the aristocracy, and they're going to be answering to either the middle class or the working class, as that's where the power is increasingly moving in the 19th century. And as we will see, industrialism is going to be a big part of that, and other things. But at this point, a small middle class and a large working class. This is difficult for us today to distinguish between those, because we don't really make that distinction today. Most people would identify themselves as middle class, but they would also identify themselves as working class. We don't see those as 2 dramatically different things, but they were dramatically different things through the 19th century, up into the 20th century. The middle class were mostly, before the Industrial Revolution, were mostly merchants And these were sort of fairly powerful people who had a good bit of money, but there weren't a whole lot of them. Industrialism is going to grow that class, and the industrialists will be the new middle class. And it's not just merchants anymore, but that's going to be people that own the factories and the businesses and the mines, and they're going to be really powerful. The working class are just the working class. They're the people that just go out and have jobs, but they don't own anything. They're not the bosses of anything. That's the middle class. So those distinctions are still very much there. And they're all vying for power. When the commoners are locked out, the Estates General, they call a meeting at Versailles of the Estates General, which is a meeting of representatives of all three of these classes are supposed to come together. But when they get there, the first two had locked out the third. They locked the doors. They just locked them out. And that's problematic. That starts rumors. And rumors started to get to spread, and the commoners got together and demanded the writing of a constitution. The French had no constitution. They had an absolute monarch, and some of them, see, the big problem is they didn't know what they wanted. Some of the French thought they wanted a constitutional monarchy like the British. They just wanted to write a constitution and keep the monarchy, but this will limit them. Others wanted a republic. They just wanted a free republic, but they were always a little bit afraid of a free republic, because the free republic is okay if we get to vote, but I don't want all those other people voting. So, that's the problem with democracy, right? We know that. We see that right now. Democracy is great, except for all those other people out there that vote. If you just let us vote, we would be fine. So that was the problem, was the French knew they didn't want what they had, but they didn't really know what they wanted. And that's going to give them a century of revolution before they finally settle into what they have now. Armed conflict begins on Bastille Day. Rumors started spreading. They weren't true, but rumors started spreading all around Paris that there were troops, that the king had troops on the outskirts of the city and they were going to come in and attack. It was not true, but doesn't need to be to have the impact. So they stormed the Bastille prison. And it's not true. At the time when they stormed the prison to get the weapons there, it had nothing to do with prisoners. The prisoners had all been moved before this. There were no prisoners in the Bastille at the time it was stormed in July of 1789, although I read all the time that it was, but they had been moved. But they stormed it to get weapons. And now you've got armed people in the streets everywhere. And, there's no turning back at that point. And I'm gonna, when we start the next century, I'm going to talk a bit more about it, because it has more to do with what's coming up than it has to do with what happened in the past. But a style of art which had been around for much of the 18th century becomes prominent after the Revolution. And that's a style called neoclassicism. And neoclassicism was being made at the same time Rococo was being made, at the same time different kinds of moralizing art was being made. In fact, neoclassical art in France really is a kind of moralizing art. It's just a variation of moralizing inspired by the Enlightenment, but we call it its own name, neoclassicism, because it's a very specific style. It's an intentional turning back and looking at classicism. And the leader of that movement is Jacques-Louis David, who is, again, one of the most important French artists of his generation and others. David was a member of the Jacobin Party. This was the political party that was largely leading the French Revolution. He was very politically involved. He was the minister for the arts when the Jacobins took over after he signed the death warrant of the king and queen in 1792. So he was a very political figure right in the middle of the action, as well as an artist. And he embraced on political grounds, a return to good French classicism. Remember that Rococo art that was associated so much with the aristocracy, that was seen as immoral and frivolous, and that became the visual image of the aristocracy. No, at no point in the history of art has art and politics been more closely connected than at the time of the French Revolution. There was a direct connection. In fact, Fragonard went from being, a sought after artist one day and literally afraid for his life the next day, on July 15th, he's heading out of town because anyone associated with the aristocracy, including paintings like that and makers of paintings like that, were all lumped together. This was seen politically. So what does David do as an opponent to the monarchy is our culture has collapsed in corruption because we've moved away from good French classical art. When they think of French art, they think of classical, and anything that's not classical is foreign. It's a corruption. It's destroying society. Watch for these parallel arguments in our world, because I hear people making them all the time. Yeah. I recognize so much of what's going on, but when you put these two side by side, one is a direct response to the other. And what David is doing in a painting like this, he's reestablishing not only classical style, and in fact, he became the director of the arts. He closed the Royal Academy for 3 years. He retooled the whole thing back to a classical style. When it reopened, it was no longer the Royal Academy, but I think they called it the National Academy of Art. And then it gets a name renamed one more time early in the 19th century when it becomes the Académie des Beaux-Arts, or the Academy of Fine Arts. But we'll talk about that in the 19th century. But, he's really reestablishing the whole academic structure. And this painting, certainly one of his most famous, Oath of the Horatii, tells a very important story. Now, this is before the revolution. One reason why they're jumping in and embracing not only a classical style, but classical subject matter, in other words, looking back to Greco-Roman scenes, is because they viewed that world as an age of virtue and honor, something they saw missing in their own world. Now, that shows me a couple things. It shows me, one, they don't know anything about the Greco-Roman world, or they wouldn't have thought of it that way, because it really wasn't. But in 1748, excavations began at Pompeii and Herculaneum. And the French, Italians, all of Europe became fascinated with the Greco-Roman world. It was like discovery of Tut's tomb, and everybody becomes obsessed with everything Egyptian. They became obsessed with everything Greco-Roman. It affected clothing styles, hairstyles, furniture styles. Neoclassical styles were everywhere. Styles of furniture they would see on Greek vases. Women's hairstyles changed. Women's clothing styles changed dramatically. There were books written, the first history books, Winckelmann's books are famous. Winckelmann was one of the earliest art historians who wrote the first history of Greek and Roman art. And it's bizarre when you read Winckelmann. They didn't understand it at all. It's in German, so a lot of people didn't read it at the time, but the ideas were still out there in the air. He was talking about all this Greek sculpture. He wrote about the ancient Greeks as if he had discovered a lost golden age. That's the language, as if he discovered the Garden of Eden, or a former culture that was in which everyone was perfect and no one was flawed. It's like, the Garden of Eden where everything is perfect. Okay, what's he looking at? Right? He's looking at all that idealized Greek art, right? People weren't like that. Greek art was just idealized. He's taking it as if that's what people looked like. as if everyone was perfect and ideal. And it just reads very naive today to us to read his words, but they didn't seem naive because he wanted it to be true. Everyone wanted it to be true. Their own world was so corrupt that they needed to believe that human beings could be better, that there was once a time when everything was perfect and we lived in, and everything looked beautiful, and they needed to believe in that perfectibility of man. And so they did, they just decided to. And so that obsession with all things Greco-Roman is sort of coming out of their needs, triggered by this excavation of this site, and it's paralleling the Enlightenment, which is all about progress and movement toward betterment. And you've all these things fit together, all these philosophies and discoveries and wishes all come together to create this obsession that leads to sort of neoclassicism. Now, this story, the Oath of the Horatii, anybody remember the story? It's a story from early Rome, in which at the time of the founding of the Roman Republic, Rome had kings before they were a republic. And two families, the Horatio family and the Curatio family, disagreed. The Curatios were on the side of the monarchy, maintaining a monarchy, where the Horatio family supported a republic. And so rather than have a big war, the two families decided each family would send out 3 sons and they would fight each other to the death, and the last person standing would determine whether Rome would be a republic or an empire. It may sound silly, but it's a heck of a lot better than killing thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, so anyway, we know Rome became a republic. So one of these 3 guys will be the last one standing. So he's constructing very artificially, again, very classically, this shallow stage-like scene with the father in the center, and he's holding the swords, and the 3 brothers, they were triplets in the story, and they're taking an oath, they're swearing an oath. And this was really popular both in ancient times, and it was also popular in 18th century, swearing oaths. So they're swearing an oath to come home with their shields or on them, which is the typical oath that was taken in ancient Rome, meaning victorious or dead. You're either, carrying your shield because you won, or you're dead and you're being carried home on your shield. So that's sort of the oath. Now, he's divided it into 2 halves, with the male masculine side on the left and the female side on the right. Now, the woman on the far right is the sister of these 3 men. This woman, who's a little bit older, she is married to one of the brothers, and these are her 2 children back here, and this is sort of a nursemaid who's taking care of the children. So what the women all know is that nobody's going to win in this, because they know they're either going to lose, well, somebody's going to lose somebody. They can't all come back. So, oh, I forgot to tell you, the sister is engaged to one of the 3 men in the other family that they're going to fight. So she's either going to lose a brother or a fiance. She's either going to lose all of her brothers or 2 of her brothers. Anyway, the women know. But it's not presented. What he really means to tell us here is that women have no sense of morality. That's the message. They're being weak. He's setting it up as strength versus weakness. And this was a device that was often taught in the academy. It's one of the little formula things for how to tell a story, is you want to juxtapose opposites, and you want to, juxtapose things like strength and weakness. And one of the classic ways to do that is masculine versus feminine. When we begin looking at 19th century, I'm going to start with David again, and I'm going to show you some more of his works. And you're going to see he's going to change his view as the revolution gets started. This is painted before the revolution begins. Once it starts, he gets a much more, I say, a little less idealized view of warfare. And he begins to see the horror of what's happening. And he witnesses like the reign of terror and the real horrors in Paris. And he's going to modify his point of view in his art. And we'll start with that, because that's sort of the beginning of kind of the 19th century, the modern era. But it's very much this. So it's clear, it's sharp, it's linear, slick, smooth, sort of frozen. All of those things we associate with a classical design and composition. You know, it's balanced very much like Leonardo's Last Supper, right? You get Christ in the middle, balanced on the sides, stabilizing triangles. I mean, tradition. I mean, there's nothing new in how this is constructed. What's really modern about it is sort of the subject that he's speaking about here, but that's all. So this is sort of where we'll begin next time, and when we get back together again. And of course, we already did that. And there was one woman artist who worked in a neoclassical style. Generally, this is very masculine. Neoclassicism is quite masculine because it's all about, strength, and, women don't have morality. So of course they can't speak of it. Even Freud thought women had no sense of morality. He talked about that. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, we're all just sitting around thinking about that, right? So she paints this painting, and I don't know who the patron was. Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures. And this is another story from Rome. First of all, stylistically, it's neoclassical. This it's very simple, very minimal, very plain, very linear in style. There's a sort of rigidness to it. There's a sort of rigidness to the morality. And in the story, Cornelia, who's a real woman, she's part of the Gracchi family. She was from one of the least corrupt of the Roman family. It's hard to find a Roman family that's not like deeply corrupt, but that family and her sons were known as being sort of good people. Anyway, she's visiting a friend, and her friend has taken out all her jewels and is showing them. And Cornelia is gesturing to her children and saying, these are my treasures. She's a good mother, right? So we're getting a neoclassical. What the neoclassicists were so good at was talking about their own world in the language of the past. She's pretending like she's speaking about Rome, like David was pretending like he was speaking about Rome, but he wasn't. And I'm going to come back to him in a minute. She's speaking about the issues of her own moment in time. And she's showing Cornelia as being the good mother with her children, raising her children. And I'm pretty sure this is meant to be Claudius. She's the mother of Claudius. You may see Claudius. Remember that? I started watching that again, working my way through. It's on, it's either on I think it's on BritBox or Acorn, one of the two that shows the British shows, and started watching Claudius. It was so much fun because I hadn't seen it in like decades and decades, but it holds up. It's still really, and I'm amazed at how many really important actors are in it in little tiny bit parts. When you watch it again, it's like, oh my God, that's so-and-so got their start in Claudius. So but anyway, it holds up if you get a chance to watch it. But that's Claudius, who was considered, one of the only good well, no, after Augustus, the other good emperor in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. When you look at David's, he is speaking about a kind of absolutism that was very much what governed the revolutionaries. I mean, the Jacobin Party was a group of people that had an absolute sense of their rightness. And there was no give and take, nothing, just I'm right and that's it.
Were they the royalists?
No, they were the revolutionaries. They were the leading political party. Actually, they were a social club because political parties were illegal. but they were a political party, and they were called the Jacobins because they met at an old Jacobin monastery. So they were called the Jacobins. That's where the name comes from. And they were very, very rigid. Kill them all, the end. Doesn't matter. You're wrong, you're dead. I mean, it was like that. And this scene, this story, and this painting all do that. It's very absolute. Oh, I didn't even tell you the rest of the story, the important part of the story. Duh. I won't make you wait until March. One of these three brothers is the last victor. He comes home and finds his sister weeping, collapsed and weeping because her fiance's dead. And he's so incensed by her lack of morality that he kills her. He is then put on trial for murder. And the father comes in and gives this impassioned plea to the now Roman Senate, because they're a republic now, right? So they have a Senate, this impassioned plea defending his son, that he had no choice. He had to do this because the girl was just not responsible. She was being irresponsible. She should have just said, yes, this is good and this is right. And he was acquitted. That's the story.
Is this a true story? Or is
It's a story written by Roman historians. It's one of those things like nobody knows. It's an ancient story written by ancient Roman historians. Whether there's a kernel of truth in it, it's undoubtedly a tale meant to explain the beginning of the Roman Republic. But at the same time, maybe there were families like this, maybe the details were made up. So it's sort of in that grounds where there's probably a speck of truth in terms of there were probably two families with these names that supported the different factors. And beyond that, we just don't know what's true or not. But it was a popular story. It was picked up by a French playwright and became a play. So the French knew this story. This play had played in Paris, and so they knew it. So that's one reason why he chose it as well. But 4 years before the revolution, he's writing a story about a revolution and the establishment of a republic. And guess who commissioned this painting? The king. So why would the French king commission a painting that's telling a story about the overthrow of the king? Well, he would have seen it differently. He saw it as being about duty and honor and doing your duty. But after the revolution, it's reinterpreted. After 89, the king's not in power anymore. Now it's interpreted as about a republic. It's about establishing a republic. So the meaning changes politically. But neoclassicism as a style was not embraced by opponents to the monarchy. Plenty of paintings were commissioned by the monarchy and by aristocrats because they saw it as a way of, in a sense, helping their poor image. They had an image of being immoral. So I'll commission neoclassical art, and then you'll see I'm not immoral. Look, I'm commissioning all this moral art. So it's a style that they all embrace to sort of, in the same way that Marie Antoinette commissions this painting to sort of juxtapose to her reputation and sort of answer to that. Neoclassicism for aristocrats became a way of answering to criticism of their immorality. But to opponents, it was seen in a different way. It was seen as in opposition to your behavior. So, and then it all gets reinterpreted. And so Rococo's gone, for 89 revolution, no more Rococo. You don't want to be associated with that. The artists either stop or leave, because by the time the Reign of Terror begins, by 92, 93, 94, they're just looking for heads to cut off. The aristocrats are either dead or gone, and they're looking for anybody that had any relation to them. Now, I had to tell you, Jacques-Louis David is the only person who only member of the Jacobin Party who lived, who signed the death warrant of the king and queen. Because what happens is the Jacobins run out of people to execute, so they turn on each other. And when Robespierre, the leader, is finally executed, that sort of ends the reign of terror. There's nobody left to kill anybody anymore. And it was like just a sigh of relief in Paris, but as we'll see when we come back, there are still problems. But David does eventually have to leave the country, but that's another story.
Does Rococo art ever come back around again?
No, not
Or is it
specifically, because
just
by
like-
definition, it was of a
the
moment
time.
in time. Painting in that way comes back.
Yeah.
Many of the romantics will paint in a loose painterly way, but they're not doing the subject for the same reason, so it's not Rococo, it's romanticism. But yes, painterly art comes back. The idea that one extreme of classicism, linear classicism, and a sort of painterly, more romantic style, those exist and will always be sort of there as a pendulum, but they'll take different forms based on what you're trying to say with that style. So Rococo itself will never come back, but so that is sort of where I wanted to leave it for now. And when we come back, probably in March, we'll go ahead and pick up here and talk about the modern age in the 19th century, which is such a wonderful